Okay, so let's try to understand today what do you mean by try with resource. Okay, but before understanding that, first of all, let's try to recall what we understood in the finally block. Okay, so what do you mean by finally block? See, finally block is nothing but it is a block which will get executed irrespective of the exception. Okay, whether you are getting any exception or not getting any exception also, after executing either try block or catch block, definitely this finally block piece of code will get executed. Okay, but why we need this finally block? The main purpose of this finally block is nothing but to perform the cleanup activity. Okay, whatever the resource object that we have created inside that try block, all this resource object we need to close it effectively once we have done with the resource object, right? So that is why we need to perform the closing operation in that finally block. Okay, but there are certain problems we are having in this finally block. Okay, so let's try to understand. Okay, so let's say our requirement is, okay, my requirement is I want to read the contents from this file. Okay, so then how we can read the contents from this file? Let's say profile.txt file. Okay, I have some content present inside. I have some content in this file, profile.txt file. What is my requirement? I want to read the contents from this file. Okay, so then how we used to write the code? So let me take a class here. Class test public static void main method. Okay, so now what is my requirement? I need to read the contents from this file. Okay, so then how we can read the contents from this file? So first of all, which class object we need to create? We need to create file reader. File reader is equals to new file reader of new file of. We need to define the file path location over here. Okay, so now after creating the file reader object and define the file path location, so then how can we read the contents from this file? By using which class? Again, buffer reader object. So we need to create the buffer reader object. How can we create this buffer reader class object? Buffer reader is equals to new buffer reader of, we need to pass this file reader object. Then by using this buffer reader object, what we can do? We can able to call this readLine method itself or not, in order to read the contents from this file. System.out.println of br.readLine method. Okay, so this is how we need to read the contents from this file itself or not. But if I am trying to compile this piece of code, so then what I will get here? I will get the compilation error itself or not. Why? Because I am trying to perform some file operation. So that is why compiler will force me to handle the exception. Which exception? IO exception, right? So that is why we need to surround this risky piece of code inside this try block and catch block. Let's say I am writing here IO exception. I am printing a.print stack trace method. Okay, now this is how we will be able to read the contents from this file itself or not. Okay, but what will happen here? Here, in order to read the contents from this file, okay, or in order to perform this file operation, I am creating this resource object itself or not. How many resource object I have created here? I have created here file reader object and I have created this buffer reader object. Okay, now after performing this reading operation, so then what we need to do? We need to close all this resource object effectively itself. So we need to close all this resource object itself or not. Okay, so then how we can close this resource object? We need to call the fr.close and br.close. And this closing operation, where we need to write? Do we need to write in the try block? No, right? Or do we need to write in the catch block? No, right? So then where we need to write this closing operation? So that is why we need to define a finally block. So inside this finally block, we need to write here fr.close method and br.close method. Okay, but if we'll see here, so in this finally block now we need to perform the closing operation, so that if there is no exception, so then it will read the contents from this file. Then after executing this try block, it will come to this finally block and all this resource object will get closed. Okay, but let's say if any exception will occur, then it will come to this catch block. After printing the stack trace, then again it will come to the finally block and this respective closing operation it will be, or respective cleanup activity it will get performed. Okay, but what is the problem here? See, this how I am creating this file reader object and buffer reader object. If you see here, this file reader object and buffer reader object itself, it is a local variable to this try block itself or not. So that is why you cannot be able to access this. You cannot be able to access this FR here. Okay. So that is why what we need to do, instead of creating this object or instead of declaring this file reader and buffer reader here, okay, try declaring outside file reader fr is equals to null, buffer reader br is equals to null. Okay, so first of all we need to define here itself outside of this try block. Okay, file reader fr is equal to null, buffer reader br is equal to null. Okay, so then this variable can be able to accessible in this finally block. If we declare here and initialize here means we cannot access this file reader object and buffer reader object inside this finally block. Why? Because it will be a local variable to this try block. So that is why we need to declare outside of this try block. Okay, and so that this variable it will be able to accessible in the finally block itself. Okay, so now with this piece of code, what will happen? We will be able to read the contents from this file itself or not. Okay, but what is the problem here? Okay, let's say I am trying to execute. Okay, if I try to execute, so then who will come into the picture? So JVM. Okay, so now whenever JVM it will calls to this main method. Okay, now what I am doing here, I am declaring this file reader object and buffer reader object as null. Okay, then in this try block, so here how I am creating this file reader object? So fr is equals to new file reader of, here itself I am defining the file path location itself or not. Okay, for example, let's say here itself this file is not present in this specified file path location itself. Okay, so then what will happen? So here itself we will get the exception itself or not. So if any exception will occur, so which exception occurred, let's say? So now let's say we got the file not found exception object got created. Okay, so now if any exception will occur, so then the respective catch block piece of code will get executed itself or not. So now if any exception will occur while creating this file reader object, so now it will comes to this catch block. It will print the stack trace. Okay, and after executing this catch block itself, so then what will happen again? Again it will execute this finally block. Okay, but while executing this finally block itself, okay, so now it is not able to create the file reader object and buffer reader object because there is some exception occurred, right? So if that exception occurred, so that means this file reader object and buffer reader object got created, no, right? So that means at this time itself this file reader object and buffer reader object value is nothing but null itself or not. So then on top of this null, if it will call this method means again it will throw some null pointer exception, right? So that is why what we need to write again, what instead of that, so what we can do again here, we need to put the null check condition. Okay, how? We need to write here if fr not equals to null and br not equals to null, so then only call this fr.close and br.close method. Okay, so this is how we need to write this finally block. Okay, so first of all we need to initialize this file reader and buffer reader outside of this try block so that this file reader and buffer reader variable can be able to accessible in this finally block. Okay, instead of declaring it as nothing but local variable, declare it outside. Okay, and if any exception will occur while creating this class object, so then this class object will not get created properly. So then in this case when it will execute this finally block, it will throw some null pointer exception. So that is how we need to handle this null check also. Okay, but if you will see here, okay, what do you mean by finally block and what is the main purpose of this finally block? We are using finally block to perform the closing operation or to perform the cleanup activity. What do you mean by cleanup activity? Whatever the resource object that we have created inside this try block, all this resource object I am closing inside this finally block. Okay, and if you see here, closing this resource object is a mandatory activity or it is an optional activity? It is a mandatory activity itself or not? So if I am creating this resource object, I have to close it. If any other developers are also creating any resource object, all this resource object has to be closed. Okay, so where in the finally block. Okay, so now what Java people thought, okay, so if this closing operation is a mandatory activity and every developer has to perform this closing operation and cleanup activity of this resource object whatever they have created inside the try block, as it is a mandatory activity. So what these Java people thought, instead of programmer handles this, or instead of programmer manage this closing operation or cleanup activity, so there should be a support from the Java language itself. Okay, so what I mean is, once programmer created this file reader object and buffer reader object, once the job is done, so immediately, so automatically this resource object has to be closed. Okay, so that means this closing operation should not be performed by the programmer. This closing operation should be performed by the Java language itself. So Java itself should provide the support to close all this resource object once the job of this resource object is done. Okay, so that is why they came up with a concept called try with resource. Okay, so what they have told, so you need to use this try with resource. What they mean by this try with resource? What they are telling? So they are telling, like, while you are writing this try block itself, don't create the resource object inside this try block. Okay, so then where they need to create this resource object? So don't create this resource object inside this try block. Okay, so then where they need to create this resource object? Instead of creating this resource object inside this try block, they need to create this resource object with this try block. Okay, so while they are writing this try itself, they need to write here file reader fr is equals to new file reader of new file of, need to define the file path location. Okay, then we need to define here buffered reader br is equals to new buffered reader. Okay, by passing this file reader object itself. Okay, so that means if you see here, now we are not creating this resource object inside this try block. Okay, so now where we are creating this resource object with this try block itself. While we are defining this try itself, with this try itself we are creating this, we are defining this resource object itself. Okay, so now, so then we no need to write here this file reader and buffer reader. Okay, what it means now, whenever this JVM it will comes to this main method, now if you see here, this file reader object and buffer reader object I am creating along with this try block itself. Okay, so that means once it will enter to this try block, it will perform this reading operation. Once the job of this resource object is done, so then automatically this resource object it will get closed. Okay, so then we no need to as a programmer, we no need to explicitly write this finally block. Okay, so once the job of this resource object is done, so then automatically this resource class object will get closed itself. Okay, so we no need to explicitly write the, or we no need to explicitly as a programmer, we should not, or we no need to write the finally block, and we should not write this closing operation explicitly. Okay, so this so that is nothing but try with resource. So then how automatically, so now if any exception will occur, so that means it will come from this try block itself or not. So once it will come from this try block, immediately this file reader object and buffer reader object it will get close itself. Okay, so how this resource object will get automatically closed? So that is why there is one interface as part of this try with resource. They have introduced one interface called auto closable, and they have defined one method called public void close method. Okay, so now as part of this try with resource, they have introduced one interface called auto closable interface. Okay, and this auto closable interface is having one method called close method. Okay, each and every resource object are implementing this auto closable interface itself. Okay, so that is why whenever JVM it will comes to this main method, with this try block itself, now you are creating this resource object. Okay, and once this job is done, once it will come out from this try block itself, so that means this job of this resource object is done. If any exception occur or it reaches to the end of this try block, immediately what this JVM it will do, it will call the close method on top of this fr and br object. Okay, so when this once this job of this resource object is done, so immediately, so the JVM itself, it will call the fr.close and br.close, because this file reader and buffer reader, both the class are as it is a resource class, and both the class is nothing but implementing which interface, auto closable interface, and overwritten this close method. So then automatically when JVM it will reaches to this end of this try block, or any exception will occur, immediately JVM it will call this file reader.close and buffer reader.close. Okay, so that is nothing but try with resource. Okay, so in this try with resource, you can only write the resource object. Okay, you cannot create any class object. For example, if let's say if I write here one class A, okay, I cannot write here A is equals to new A. So that means what I mean is I cannot create any class object with this try block. Okay, in order to create this object with this try blocks, okay, so this class has to be implement which interface, is nothing but auto closable interface. So that means if I am writing this class A and if I am creating this class A object in this try itself, okay, so then I will get the compilation error saying this class A is nothing but it is not implementing the auto closable interface. Okay, so then when I can write this A is equal, or when we can create this class A object, if this class A is implementing which interface, if it is implements auto closable interface and override which method, public void close method. Let's say I am writing something system.out.println of Java. Okay, so that means if I'm so now as this class A is nothing but implementing this auto closable interface, so then I can write with this try. Okay, so now once this try block is completed, automatically JVM it will call this close method and this piece of code it will get executed. Okay, so you cannot create any class object in this try with resource. Okay, so in order to create this class A object with this try, so this class has to be implement which interface, auto closable interface. Okay, so that is why all these resource object like file reader, buffer reader, connection statement, prepare statement, result set, all these resource classes are now is implementing which interface, auto closable interface, and overriding which method, close method. Okay, so that is why whenever any exception will occur, or whenever JVM it will reach to this end of this try block, or if any exception will also occur, so then immediately JVM itself it will call the close method on top of this resource object. Okay, as a programmer we should not manually perform this closing operation or cleanup activity code. This closing operation and cleanup activity should be done by the JVM itself. Okay, instead of as a programmer we managing those closing operation, so there will be some support from this Java programming language itself. Okay, by using this try with resource, so then we no need to explicitly write this finally block. Okay, so that is nothing but try with resource. Okay, all the resource object instead of creating inside the try block, we need to create along with this try block, is nothing but try with resource. Okay, so what do you mean by try with resource? What we understood, so whatever the resource object that we have created inside the try block, so those resource object it will get automatically closed by the JVM itself. Okay, when if any exception will occur, or if the JVM flow it will reaches to the end of the try block, automatically those resource object it will be closed by the JVM itself. Okay, so instead of as a programmer, instead of we manually closing those resource object inside the finally block, so we are using the try with resource. Okay, so as all these resource object are mandatorily we need to close all this resource object, so that is why so JVM it will close all this resource object once the job of that resource object is done. Okay, so let's try to understand through one code. Okay, so for example, let's say I'm creating one class here, class test. Okay, so let me have the main method here. So what I want to do, so what is my requirement, I want to read the contents from this file. Okay, so in order to read the contents from this file, so we need to create two resource object itself or not. One is file reader object, one is buffer reader object. But we should not create those object inside the try block. So where we need to create those resource object along with this try block itself. So in this try block itself, we need to create which class object? File reader. Fr is equals to new file reader of, we need to pass the file path location itself. Let's say I'm passing here profile.txt file, and which object again we need to create? Buffer reader object. So buffer reader br is equals to new buffer reader. Okay, and we need to pass this file reader, and we need to handle this exception by writing the catch block. Which exception we need to handle? Catch block of IO exception e. Here let me print here e dot print stack trace. Now see here, we are creating these resource object, file reader object and buffer reader object not inside the try block. Where we are creating? In with this try block itself, we are creating this resource object. Okay, so then we can perform the operation like br system.out.println of br.readline method. Okay, so this is how we will be able to read the contents from this file. Okay, and while reading the or while creating this resource object, we are creating this resource object inside with this try block itself. Okay, so that means whenever this JVM it will comes to the end of this try block, or whenever JVM will execute this try block, or if any exception will occur, so then immediately this file reader object and buffer reader object it will get closed automatically. As a programmer, we should not close it manually inside the finally block. Okay, so JVM itself it will be responsible to close all these resource object once it will complete the execution of this try block, and if any exception it will get occurred. Okay, so immediately this resource object it will get closed by the JVM itself. How it will close automatically by the JVM? So each and every resource class is nothing but implementing one interface called auto closable interface. Okay, if you'll see here, this file reader it is extending this input stream reader, and if you'll go again into this input stream reader, it is extending this reader class. Again if you'll go to this reader, it is implementing which interface? Closable interface. And if you'll go again to this closable interface, you will see like this closable interface it is extending which interface? Auto closable interface. Okay, and this auto closable interface is nothing but it is having one method called close method. So this close method it will be called when the try block piece of code execution will get completed itself. Okay, similarly in case of this buffer reader also, it is extending this reader and it is implementing the closable interface. Again it is extending to the auto closable interface. Okay, so that means all the resource classes are nothing but implementing one interface called auto closable interface and overriding the close method. Okay, we cannot create any class object inside this try block. Okay, for example, let's say I'm having one class here, class A. Now let's say it is having some method public void m1 method. Okay, so now I'm having this class A which is having this m1 method. Okay, so now we cannot create the object of this class A inside this try. Okay, so that means what I mean is I cannot write here, or I cannot create the A class object like A is equal to new A. I cannot write here itself. Okay, why? Because this A class is nothing but it is not a resource class. Okay, so in order to create the class object with this try block, so this class A has to be implementing one interface called auto closable interface. Okay, and what is the rules we are having? If a class is implementing one interface, we have to override the respective method public void close method. We need to override it. Okay, let's say I'm writing here system.out.println of cleanup activity. So now once it will reach end of this try block, this close method it will be called, and this cleanup activity it will get printed. Okay, now if you'll see, I'm able to create this class A object in this with this try block itself or not? Okay, why? Because now this A class is nothing but it is implementing this auto closable interface. After executing this M1 method, then automatically it will call this close method. Okay, why? Because it is implementing the, why? Because I'm writing it as a try with resource. Okay, and this A class is implementing which interface? Auto closable interface. Let me try to execute now. Okay, now after executing this Java, now it is calling this close method and it is printing this cleanup activity. Okay, so this close method it will be called after executing this a.m1 method. Okay, so this is nothing but try with resource. What is the purpose of this try with resource? Instead of we manually close all these resource object, so jvm it will close all these resource object once the try block piece of code it will get executed, or if any exception will occur. Okay, so then these resource object it will be automatically closed. Okay, and how it is getting closed? Because why? Because all the resource classes are implementing one interface called auto closable interface. Okay, so that, and then this close method it will be called and the respective close operation or cleanup activity it will be performed. Okay, so this is nothing but try with resource.